Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The storm had rolled in quickly, as if summoned by the very sea itself. The waves clawed hungrily at the jagged cliffs, their spray mingling with the unrelenting rain that lashed against the solitary lighthouse perched high above. The beam of its light cut through the darkness, slicing through mist and storm as if trying to hold back something unseen, something waiting just beyond the horizon. Adele Ward stood at the edge of the small coastal town's harbor, clutching the hood of her raincoat as the gale threatened to rip it away. The wind howled like a wounded animal, carrying the scent of salt and decay. Her suitcase sat at her feet, a forlorn relic in this desolate place. The townspeople had warned her not to come, but she couldn't ignore the pull of the unanswered questions. She'd arrived on the evening ferry, the only passenger to disembark. The town, aptly named Greystone, seemed forgotten by time, its cobblestone streets slick with rain and its weathered buildings leaning against each other like weary soldiers. Most of the windows were dark, but a few flickered with dim candlelight, as if the electricity here was as unreliable as the sea itself. Adele was here for answers. The lighthouse had claimed her brother, Simon, or so the townsfolk said. A seasoned sailor, Simon had vanished 2 months ago, his small fishing boat found adrift not far from the cliffs. No body had been recovered, no explanation given, only whispered rumors about the lighthouse and the man who kept it. She had tried to brush off their warnings. Superstition, she had told herself. But now, standing under the oppressive weight of the storm and the lighthouse's unyielding glare, she wasn't so sure. The lighthouse loomed above, a crooked sentinel on its precarious perch. Its stones were blackened by age and weather, giving it an almost organic appearance, like a jagged tooth rising from the earth. The single beam of light rotated methodically, casting fleeting glances across the storm-racked sea. It wasn't just the structure that felt wrong, it was the way it seemed to watch her, its light pausing for a heartbeat longer whenever it passed over the town below. Adele couldn't shake the feeling that it was less a beacon of guidance and more a watchtower, guarding a secret it would kill to protect. The tavern at the harbor, the Mariner's Rest, was the only place open at this hour. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood, stale beer, and the faint tang of brine. A handful of locals sat hunched over their drinks, their eyes darting to Adele as she entered. "Evening, miss," said the barkeep, a grizzled man with a face weathered by decades of salt and sun. His name tag read Elliot. His voice was low, the kind of tone reserved for people you didn't want to draw too much attention to. "Can I get you something? Or are you just passing through?" "I'm looking for the lighthouse keeper," Adele said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. The room fell silent. A chair scraped against the floor as one of the patrons shifted uneasily. The barkeep's hand froze mid-polish, the rag trembling slightly. "You don't want to be messing with that," Elliot said, his voice a whisper now. "The keeper doesn't take kindly to visitors. And the lighthouse, well, it's best left alone." "I don't have a choice," Adele replied, her resolve hardening. "Simon Ward. He was my brother. I need to know what happened to him." Elliot sighed heavily, setting the glass down with a soft thud. I remember him. Good man. The sea took him, lass. That's all there is to it." But Adele didn't believe that. Not entirely. She'd heard the stories, the whispers about the lighthouse and its keeper. How ships disappeared near its light. How people who went to the lighthouse sometimes never came back. "Can you take me there?" she asked. Elliot shook his head. "Not tonight. Storm's too fierce. You'd best wait till morning if you're still set on going dot." As the storm raged outside, Adele sat by the tavern's fire, listening to the murmurs of the locals. They spoke of the lighthouse keeper in hushed tones, as if afraid he might hear them even from miles away. "Name's Victor Holloway," one of the patrons said, a wiry man with a face that seemed to have been carved from driftwood. "Been there longer than anyone can remember. Some say he's cursed, others say he's the curse. Don't know why he stays up there," a woman added, her voice quivering. "He's not like us. Never was. And that lighthouse, it's not natural. The light don't just guide ships, it calls them. Calls them to their doom." Adele clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't care about their superstitions. She cared about the truth. Morning came, but the storm had not fully abated. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the wind, though still strong, was no longer a howling beast. Adele stood at the base of the cliffs, staring up at the winding path that led to the lighthouse. Her suitcase felt heavier than it should have, and every step seemed to echo with an unspoken warning. As she climbed, she noticed strange marks on the rocks, symbols etched into the stone, their meaning unknown. They were weathered and faint, but their presence sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though when she turned around, the path behind her was empty. By the time she reached the lighthouse, the drizzle had turned into a fine mist, and the wind tugged at her clothes like unseen hands. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of oil and salt. The walls were lined with maps, logs, and equipment, but everything felt out of place, like a replica of what a lighthouse should be, rather than the real thing. "Who's there?" a voice called, low and gravelly. Victor Holloway emerged from the shadows, his frame tall and imposing. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in years. He studied Adele with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I'm Adele Ward," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'm here about my brother." Victor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "Why?" she demanded. "What are you hiding?" Victor stepped closer, the light from a flickering lantern casting eerie shadows across his face. "There are things you don't understand. Things you don't want to understand. Your brother," he heard the call. "Same as the others." "What call?" Adele asked, her voice rising. "What happened to him?" Victor turned away, his shoulders slumping. "The lighthouse takes what it wants," he said. "And it never lets go." Before Adele could press him further, a sudden noise cut through the air, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the lighthouse. Victor stiffened, his face pale. "It's starting," he whispered. "What's starting?" Adele asked, panic creeping into her voice. Victor didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a set of keys from a hook on the wall and began locking the doors and windows. "Stay inside," he said. "No matter what you hear, do not open the door." But Adele wasn't about to sit idly by. As Victor worked, she noticed a notebook lying open on a nearby table. The pages were filled with sketches of strange symbols, diagrams of the lighthouse's mechanisms, and hastily scrawled notes. "The light doesn't just guide, it hunts." "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the notebook. Victor snatched it from her hands, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "It's nothing you need to worry about." But it was too late. Adele had already seen enough to know that the lighthouse and its keeper were hiding something far darker than she had imagined. The wind's mournful whistle snaked through the cracks in the lighthouse walls, a constant reminder of the isolation Adele now found herself in. The world outside was veiled in fog, the sea and sky merging into a single, impenetrable grey. Within the confines of the lighthouse, time seemed to stretch unnaturally, every creak of the floorboards and drip of water from the ceiling amplifying the oppressive silence. Victor had retreated to the upper level, leaving Adele alone in the dimly lit main chamber. Her fingers traced the edges of the journal she'd managed to slip into her pocket when he wasn't looking. She had caught enough glimpses to know it was important, though she didn't yet understand the full scope of its contents. She flipped it open, scanning the messy scrawl that filled its pages. Most of it was indecipherable, a jumble of coordinates, nautical terms, and cryptic phrases, but one sentence stood out, scrawled in jagged, hurried handwriting. "The light calls them, but it isn't salvation." As Adele continued leafing through the journal, the lighthouse groaned under the weight of the wind outside. Her eyes locked onto a drawing, a crude depiction of the lighthouse itself, with thick, dark lines radiating from its beacon like tendrils reaching into the night. Beneath it, a cryptic note read, "Once it sees you, it never stops watching." A chill ran down her spine. What was the light? Why would Simon, or anyone, be drawn to something so clearly malevolent? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps descending the spiral staircase. Victor emerged, his face pale and grim. "You've been snooping," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I need answers, Adele shot back, holding the journal tightly. This light, what is it? What happened to my brother? Victor's jaw tightened. He hesitated, then moved closer to the table, his hands trembling as he placed a lantern down. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice a whisper. The light doesn't just guide ships. It searches. And once it finds someone, it doesn't let go. Adele's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Searches for what? Victor didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, gazing out the small, rain-streaked window. You should leave before it's too late, he said, his voice hollow. But I don't think it will let you now. That night, Adele stayed in one of the lower chambers, her nerves frayed and her mind racing with questions. Sleep eluded her as the lighthouse groaned and creaked around her. Then, just as she began to drift off, she heard it, a soft knock at the door. Her heart leapt into her throat. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, she sat up, her gaze fixed on the heavy wooden door at the far end of the room. Victor, she called out, her voice barely audible. No response. The knocking grew insistent, a frantic rhythm that echoed through the chamber. Adele stood, her legs shaky, and moved toward the door. But before she could reach it, Victor appeared out of nowhere, his hand clamping down on her wrist. Don't, he hissed, his eyes wild. It's not who you think. Adele stared at him, her breath caught in her chest. Who is it? Victor didn't answer. Instead, he yanked her away from the door and dragged her up the stairs, his grip like iron. You wanted answers, he said. I'll show you. Victor led her to the top of the lighthouse, where the massive lens of the beacon turned slowly, casting its harsh light out over the sea. The air here was thick and heavy, as if the lighthouse itself were alive and breathing. Look, Victor said, gesturing toward the glass. Adele hesitated, then stepped closer. The light's rotation slowed as it passed her, almost as if it were watching her. Her reflection in the glass flickered unnaturally, her features distorted and shifting. What is this? She whispered, backing away. Victor's face was grim. The light shows you what it wants you to see. Sometimes it's the past, sometimes the future. And sometimes, it shows you what it's taken. As the light passed again, Adele saw something that made her blood run cold. It was Simon, or at least, a shadow of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his lips moved soundlessly as if trying to speak. Simon, she cried, reaching out instinctively. Victor grabbed her arm, pulling her back. It's not him, he said sharply. It's a memory. A fragment. The light keeps pieces of the ones it takes. Adele stared at him, her chest heaving. Why? What does it want? Victor's expression darkened. It wants to feed. The more it takes, the stronger it becomes. And the more it calls. The following day, Adele demanded answers from Victor, but he remained evasive, speaking in riddles and half-truths. Frustrated, she decided to explore the lighthouse on her own. She found herself drawn to the basement, a cold, damp space filled with the hum of machinery. The walls were lined with shelves of dusty books and strange artifacts, rusted compasses, chipped lanterns, and pieces of driftwood carved with those same strange symbols she'd seen on the cliffs. In the center of the room stood a locked chest, its iron exterior pitted with age. Adele's heart raced as she crouched down and examined it. She had no idea what was inside, but she felt certain it held something important. Before she could investigate further, she heard Victor's voice echoing from above. Adele, where are you? Quickly, she stood and made her way back up the stairs, her mind racing. That evening, Adele confronted Victor again, this time with the journal and the symbols she'd seen. These markings, what do they mean? She demanded, slamming the journal down on the table. And what's in the chest downstairs? Victor stared at her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. You don't know what you're messing with, he said. The symbols, they're wards. Protection. Or at least, they were supposed to be. But the light's too strong now. Nothing can keep it contained. And the chest? Victor hesitated, then shook his head. It's better you don't know. But Adele wasn't willing to let it go. That night, while Victor was asleep, she crept back down to the basement with a crowbar she'd found among the tools. The chest resisted at first, But eventually, the lock gave way with a loud crack. Inside, she found a collection of old, weathered maps and photographs. One of the maps marked the location of the lighthouse, with strange annotations scribbled in the margins. But it was the photographs that stopped her cold. They were of people, dozens of them, standing in front of the lighthouse at different points in time. Their faces were shadowed and indistinct, but one thing was clear: Simon was among them. Adele's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through the photos frantically, searching for more clues. In one of them, she noticed Victor, much younger but unmistakable, standing at the edge of the group. "What is this?" she whispered. Before she could examine further, a voice whispered in her ear, low and chilling. "You shouldn't have done that." She whirled around, but the room was empty. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the air grew colder. From above, she heard the sound of the beacon turning faster, its hum growing louder and more insistent. Victor's warning echoed in her mind: once it sees you, it never stops watching. As the storm outside intensified once again, Adele climbed to the top of the lighthouse. The beacon's light was no longer steady, it flickered and pulsed, casting erratic shadows across the room. Victor was there, his face pale and drawn. "You've awakened it," he said, his voice trembling. "The light knows you now. What does it want?" Adele demanded, holding up one of the photographs. "Why is Simon in this? What did you do to him?" Victor shook his head, his expression filled with guilt. "I didn't do anything," he said. "The light chooses. I just try to keep it contained." But Adele didn't believe him. She could feel the weight of the light's gaze, its presence pressing against her mind. As the beacon turned, she saw Simon's face again, clearer this time. His lips moved, forming a single, desperate word: run. The storm outside had grown into a roaring tempest, hammering against the walls of the lighthouse. The beacon's steady hum now felt alive, vibrating with an eerie intensity. Adele's breaths came in shallow gasps as the air grew heavier, charged with an unexplainable energy. The photograph of Simon still trembled in her hand, his silent plea for her to run etched into her mind. She turned toward Victor, her voice trembling but resolute. "You've been lying to me this entire time. What is this light really, Victor? Why is Simon trapped in it?" Victor hesitated, his face a mix of fear and regret. "The light," he swallowed hard, his words reluctant. "It's not just a beacon for ships. It's a doorway." "A doorway to what?" Adele demanded, her voice rising. "To something that doesn't belong here," Victor replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's ancient. Older than this lighthouse, older than anything we understand. It hungers, Adele. And it uses the light to lure people in." Victor paced the room, his steps heavy with guilt. "When I first took this job, I thought the stories were just superstition, folklore passed down by the old keepers. But then I saw it for myself. The light doesn't just guide, it consumes. It shows people what they want most, draws them closer, and then it takes them." Adele's stomach turned. "Takes them where?" Victor met her gaze, his eyes hollow. "I don't know. All I know is they don't come back. Not as themselves." Adele clenched her fists. "And Simon? Is he gone?" Victor hesitated, then shook his head. "Not entirely. The light doesn't always take everything. Sometimes it leaves pieces, shadows of who they were. But they're not whole, Adele. They're trapped." Adele's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. The photographs, the symbols, the distorted image of Simon in the light, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon, it was a predator. Before Adele could respond, the beacon's light swung around again, its glow slicing through the storm outside. This time, it didn't just illuminate the sea. It lingered, casting an unnatural glow that seeped into the room like liquid. Adele felt it before she saw it, a pull, subtle at first but growing stronger with each passing second. It was as if the light were alive, reaching for her, calling her. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the table for support. In the corner of her eye, she saw Simon again, his image flickering in and out of focus within the glow. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "Adele." Victor's voice snapped her back to reality. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. Don't look at it. That's how it starts. But it was too late. The light had already planted its seed. Victor dragged Adele away from the beacon, his grip firm despite his trembling hands. We have to leave. Now. Before it gets stronger. No, Adele said, pulling free. I'm not leaving Simon. There has to be a way to bring him back. Victor's face darkened. You don't understand. The light doesn't give anything back. Once it takes someone, they're gone. You saw what it did to Simon. He's just an echo now. That's not good enough. Adele shouted. I'm not giving up on him. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. There's one way, he admitted reluctantly. Adele's eyes locked onto his. What is it? Victor hesitated, then gestured toward the basement. The chest. The maps. They show where the light's power is strongest. If we can disrupt it there, we might be able to weaken its hold. And Simon? Victor's jaw tightened. If we're lucky, we might be able to free him. But it's risky. If we fail, the light will take both of us. Armed with the maps and a lantern, Adele and Victor descended into the storm. The path marked on the map led them away from the lighthouse, down a jagged trail carved into the cliffs. The wind howled around them, carrying with it whispers that sent shivers down Adele's spine. Do you hear that? She asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Victor nodded grimly. It's the light. It knows what we're doing. As they neared the edge of the cliffs, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. The sea below churned violently, waves crashing against the rocks with a deafening roar. In the distance, Adele could see a faint glow emanating from a cavern carved into the cliffs. That's it, Victor said, pointing toward the glow. That's where the light's power is concentrated. Adele swallowed hard, her heart pounding. And what do we do when we get there? Victor pulled a rusted iron key from his pocket. We seal it, he said. The old keepers created this key to lock the light away. It won't destroy it, but it'll trap it for a while, at least. As they approached the cavern, the air grew heavier, pressing against Adele like an invisible weight. The whispers grew louder, forming words that seemed to echo in her mind. Adele, come closer. Simon is waiting. She shook her head, trying to block out the voice, but it was relentless. Images of Simon flashed before her eyes, memories of their childhood, his laughter, his smile. Stay focused, Victor said, gripping her arm. It's trying to lure you in. But the light wasn't just attacking her mind. As they entered the cavern, the glow intensified, casting the walls in an otherworldly light. Shadows danced and twisted, forming shapes that seemed almost human. One of them stepped forward, its form flickering like a flame. Adele froze as she recognized the shadow's face. Simon. The shadow didn't respond. It reached for her, its hand outstretched, its eyes pleading. Don't! Victor shouted, pulling her back. It's not him. But Adele hesitated. The shadow looked so real, so familiar. Could Victor be wrong? At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone archway, its surface carved with the same strange symbols Adele had seen in the lighthouse. The light poured from the archway, pulsating like a heartbeat. This is it, Victor said, his voice trembling. The doorway. We have to close it. He handed Adele the key. You'll need to insert this into the lock at the top of the arch. But be careful. The light will do everything it can to stop you. Adele nodded, her grip on the key tight. She stepped toward the archway, the light's pull growing stronger with each step. The shadows swarmed around her, their whispers filling her ears. She could see Simon among them, his face contorted with pain. Adele, he said, his voice barely audible. Don't leave me. Tears streamed down her face as she reached the archway. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she raised the key. Adele. Victor's voice cut through the chaos. You have to do it now. With a deep breath, she plunged the key into the lock. The moment the key turned, the light erupted in a blinding flash. Adele was thrown backward, her body hitting the ground with a painful thud. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into the air. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, The light began to dim, its glow retreating into the archway. But as Adele pushed herself to her feet, she realized something was wrong. The archway wasn't closing. Instead, the light seemed to be gathering, condensing into a single, humanoid form. Victor's face paled. That's not supposed to happen. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It looked at Adele, and for a moment, she thought she saw Simon's face. Adele, it said, its voice a haunting mix of her brother's and something far darker. You can't stop it. This is only the beginning. The cavern trembled as the humanoid figure of light took its full shape, a radiant being standing tall within the archway. Its form was both mesmerizing and terrifying, flickering with patterns of ancient symbols that writhed like living tattoos on its glowing body. Its eyes, twin orbs of blinding brilliance, fixed on Adele. Victor stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. This wasn't supposed to happen. The doorway was supposed to seal it away. The figure took a step forward, the soundless motion rippling through the air like a shockwave. Adele felt the weight of its gaze, a pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. You've awakened me, the being said, its voice layered with countless tones, as though an entire choir of whispers spoke in unison. Why do you seek to undo what has been bound for centuries? Adele gripped the iron key tightly in her hand, the cold metal a lifeline against the overwhelming heat radiating from the creature. You have my brother, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I want him back. The being tilted its head, its glowing features unreadable. Your brother is mine now. He chose to step into the light, to seek what lay beyond. Do you not understand? The light does not take, it offers. Offers what? Adele demanded. Pain. Emptiness. You've trapped him. No, the being replied. I offered him truth. It is you who cling to illusions of loss and separation. The light reveals all, and in return, it asks only for surrender. Victor grabbed Adele's arm, pulling her back. We need to leave, he hissed. Now, before it consumes us both. No. Adele snapped, jerking free. I'm not leaving without Simon. The being's gaze shifted to Victor, its brilliance intensifying. You have served me for so long, yet now you betray your purpose. You were the keeper, the guardian of the threshold. And now you would defy me? Victor's face twisted with guilt and anger. I didn't know what I was protecting. I thought I was safeguarding lives, not feeding them to this. The being stepped closer, its presence amplifying the storm outside. The winds howled through the cavern, and the crashing waves grew deafening. Your defiance is meaningless. The light is eternal. It cannot be sealed, only delayed. And now, it will claim you both. Adele stepped forward, her voice cutting through the storm. No. You said the light offers. Then offer me a choice. The being paused, its head tilting in curiosity. What would you give to free your brother? Adele's heart pounded. She already knew the answer. Anything. Take me instead. Victor shouted in protest. Adele, no. You don't understand what you're saying. But the being raised a hand, silencing him. A noble offer, it said, the symbols on its body glowing brighter. But the light does not deal in exchanges. It does not trade lives, it absorbs, it transcends. If you wish to take his place, you must do so willingly, knowing you will never return. Adele's chest tightened. The weight of the decision bore down on her, but she couldn't let Simon remain in this nightmare. She took a step forward, the key still clutched in her trembling hand. I'll do it. Just let him go. The being's light pulsed, and for a moment, Simon's shadowy form appeared beside it. His face was distorted, his features flickering between recognition and despair. Adele, no, he whispered. You don't understand. The light, it's not what it seems. She hesitated, her resolve wavering. What do you mean? Simon reached out, his translucent hand passing through hers like mist. It doesn't free you. It binds you. Forever. You don't save me by joining me, you trap yourself. Adele's mind spun. Was this another trick of the light? Or was Simon warning her against a fate worse than death? Victor seized the moment of hesitation, stepping in front of Adele. "There's another way," he shouted, holding up the map. The old keepers wrote about a failsafe. A way to collapse the archway completely. "It's dangerous, but it might destroy the light for good." The being laughed, the sound reverberating like 1,000 breaking mirrors. "You cannot destroy the light. It is beyond your comprehension, beyond your reach. You are mere shadows, fleeting and inconsequential." Adele glanced at Victor, her mind racing. "What's the failsafe?" Victor pointed to the symbols carved into the archway. "These markings, they're like a circuit. If we break them in the right sequence, it should destabilize the portal. But we'll have to get close, too close. And if it works..." Victor's face was grim. "It'll seal the light, but it could also destroy everything in this cavern. Including us." Adele nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then we have no choice." The two moved quickly, their actions fueled by desperation. Adele approached the archway, her fingers trembling as she traced the glowing symbols. Each one seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a heartbeat in sync with the light's presence. Victor called out instructions, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Start with the symbol on the left, circle it 3 times, then press the center." Adele followed his directions, feeling the heat of the light intensify as she worked. The being watched them, its form growing more erratic, its glow flickering like a dying star. "You cannot undo what has been set in motion," it said, its voice filled with both rage and sadness. "The light is inevitable. You are delaying the tide." "Maybe so," Adele shot back, "but we'll stop it here and now." The archway began to tremble as the symbols dimmed one by one. The light's pull grew stronger, as if it were fighting against their efforts. Shadows erupted from the ground, clawing at Adele and Victor, trying to drag them back. As Adele reached the final symbol, the light flared, blinding her. Simon's shadow appeared before her again, his face contorted in anguish. "Adele, stop," he pleaded. "You'll destroy me too." Tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry, Simon. I can't let this thing hurt anyone else." She pressed the final symbol, and the archway let out a deafening crack. The light screamed, its brilliance fracturing into shards that pierced the cavern walls. The ground shook violently, and chunks of rock began to fall from the ceiling. Victor grabbed Adele, pulling her toward the entrance. "We have to go." But Adele hesitated, her eyes fixed on Simon's fading form. "I can't leave him." "You don't have a choice," Victor shouted, dragging her away as the cavern began to collapse. The two barely made it out as the archway crumbled behind them, the light's final scream echoing into the stormy night. They tumbled onto the rocky shore, gasping for breath as the lighthouse loomed above them, its beam now dark and lifeless. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy fog. Adele stared at the lighthouse, her heart aching. "Do you think it's gone?" Victor shook his head. "I don't know. But we stopped it, for now." Adele glanced at the horizon, where the first rays of dawn were breaking through the storm clouds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world seemed quiet. But as she turned to Victor, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. His shadow, cast by the rising sun, wasn't moving in sync with his body. It lingered, flickering at the edges, as if it didn't quite belong. Victor noticed her gaze and froze. "What is it?" Adele pointed, her voice trembling. "Your shadow." He turned slowly, his face paling as he saw it for himself. No, that's not possible. We sealed it." But deep down, they both knew the truth. The light wasn't gone. It had left its mark on them, a reminder that its reach extended far beyond the confines of the lighthouse. As they stood in silence, the faintest whisper carried on the wind, "The light never fades." The morning sunlight spilled across the jagged rocks of the island's shoreline, painting the wet, mossy surface with a deceptive golden glow. The storm had dissipated, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The lighthouse stood silent now, its once ominous beam extinguished, its frame looming as a hollowed shell against the brightening sky. Adele sat on the rocks, her knees drawn up to her chest, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the iron key that had never left her grip. Every muscle in her body ached, but her mind was far too restless to acknowledge the exhaustion. Victor stood nearby, his back to her, staring at the ruins of the cavern entrance. Smoke and dust still rose from the collapsed structure, curling in faint tendrils that disappeared into the fresh breeze. He hadn't said much since they escaped, but his hunched shoulders and clenched fists spoke volumes. "Do you think it's really over?" Adele asked, her voice breaking the fragile quiet. Victor turned to her, his face pale and hollow. "The archway is destroyed. The light can't reach through anymore, not the way it did before." He hesitated, his eyes flickering to the lighthouse and then to his own shadow stretching across the rocks. "But that doesn't mean it's gone." Adele's gaze followed his to the ground, where his shadow still flickered faintly, its edges unstable, almost shimmering in the sunlight. The sight sent a fresh wave of unease through her. "It marked us, didn't it?" she said quietly. Victor nodded. "The old keepers wrote about this. Even if you survive an encounter with the light, it leaves its imprint. A reminder. You can't just walk away from something like that unscathed." Adele's grip on the key tightened. The weight of Simon's loss hung heavily on her, mingling with the realization that she would never be the same. The light hadn't just taken her brother, it had changed her. She glanced at Victor, studying the lines of his face. "How long have you known about the mark?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, his voice barely audible. "I noticed it years ago. Little things at first, shadows that didn't match my movements, whispers in the wind that no one else could hear. It never goes away. You just learn to live with it. Or not," Adele said bitterly, thinking of Simon. Despite her exhaustion, Adele forced herself to her feet. Her boots slipped on the wet rocks, but she steadied herself, her eyes fixed on the lighthouse. Victor frowned. "What are you doing?" "There has to be something left," she said, her voice resolute. "Simon, his shadow, his voice, something. I can't just leave without knowing for sure." Victor's expression darkened. "We destroyed the source." If he didn't come through before the archway collapsed, he didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of his words pressed down on her like a physical force. "I don't care," Adele snapped. "I'm not giving up on him." Victor hesitated, then sighed. "You're stubborn, just like he was." Adele turned to him, her eyes blazing. "You can stay here if you want. But I'm going back in." The interior of the lighthouse was a stark contrast to the morning's warmth. It was cold, damp, and silent, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Adele's footsteps echoed on the spiral staircase as she ascended, each creak of the wooden steps a reminder of how precarious the structure had become. Victor followed reluctantly, his flashlight casting long, eerie beams across the walls. "This place should have collapsed years ago," he muttered. "It's like it's been preserved." Adele didn't respond. Her focus was on the shadows that danced along the walls, shifting in unnatural patterns as the light moved. At the top of the staircase, they reached the lantern room. The massive glass panels were cracked and smeared with grime, and the beacon's mechanism was rusted and inert. But the room still held an oppressive presence, as if the light's influence hadn't entirely vanished. Adele's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer to the center of the room. There, faintly etched into the metal floor, was a symbol she recognized, the same swirling pattern that had adorned the archway in the cavern below. "It's still here," she whispered. Victor shook his head. "No. That's just a remnant. A scar. The real power's gone." But Adele wasn't so sure. She knelt down, running her fingers over the grooves of the symbol. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of warmth beneath her touch, like the dying embers of a fire. As she traced the symbol, a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible. She froze, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Victor frowned. "Hear what?" Adele strained to listen, her pulse quickening as the whisper grew louder. It wasn't coming from the room around her, it was coming from within her own mind. "Adele." Her breath hitched. "Simon." Victor's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Adele ignored him, closing her eyes and focusing on the voice. It was faint, fractured, but unmistakably her brother's. "I'm here, but I can't, it's pulling. Help." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Simon, where are you? How do I help you?" The whisper faded, leaving an aching silence in its wake. Victor grabbed her shoulder, shaking her. "Adele, snap out of it. There's nothing here." She pulled away from him, her eyes blazing with determination. "He's here, Victor. I heard him. He's trapped, but he's still here." Victor ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Even if he is, there's nothing we can do. The archway's destroyed. The light's power is broken." Adele shook her head. "No. It's not gone, it's just hidden. And if it's hidden, I can find it." Victor stared at her, his face a mixture of fear and pity. "Adele, don't do this to yourself. You've already lost so much. Don't let it take you too." But she was already moving, her eyes scanning the room for any clue, any fragment of the light's lingering presence. Her gaze fell on the cracked glass panels of the lantern, and she froze. There, etched into the grime, was another symbol, a faint spiral that pulsed with an almost imperceptible glow. "I found it," she whispered. Victor followed her gaze, his face pale. "Adele, no. You don't know what you're doing." "I don't care," she said, her voice resolute. "If there's even a chance I can save him, I have to try." Adele reached out, her fingers brushing the glowing symbol. The moment she made contact, a surge of warmth flooded through her, and the world around her seemed to shift. The lighthouse faded into darkness, replaced by an endless expanse of light and shadow. She could feel Simon's presence, faint but unmistakable, somewhere in the void. "Simon," she called out, her voice echoing into the abyss. For a moment, she thought she saw him, a figure in the distance, shrouded in shadow. But as she moved closer, the light began to pull at her, dragging her deeper into its embrace. "Adele," his voice whispered, filled with both longing and despair. She reached out, but before she could touch him, the light flared, and she was thrust back into the lantern room. Victor caught her as she stumbled, her body trembling from the effort. "What happened?" he demanded. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He's still there. And the light, it's still watching." Victor's expression was grim. "Then we need to leave. Now." As they descended the lighthouse, Adele couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple and shift, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. When they stepped out into the sunlight, the island seemed brighter, calmer. But Adele knew the peace was an illusion. Victor placed a hand on her shoulder. "What now?" She looked at him, her face hardened by resolve. "We find another way. We keep fighting. For Simon." He nodded, though the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. As they made their way back to the boat, Adele cast one last glance at the lighthouse. Its beam was gone, its presence diminished. But she could still feel the light's pull, a faint hum at the edge of her consciousness. And as they sailed away, a single thought lingered in her mind. The light never truly fades. It only waits. Story number 2. The sun was dipping beneath the horizon, casting a warm golden hue across the sprawling field. The gentle hum of crickets filled the air as James Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow, adjusting the strap of his worn backpack. The fields stretched endlessly, an ocean of wheat and tall grass swaying in the evening breeze. The world seemed to be slowing down, as it always did when dusk began to settle over the countryside. James was used to this quiet solitude. He'd been working on the farm since he was old enough to hold a shovel, raised by his grandfather, who had passed on the responsibility of maintaining the land when he'd passed years ago. The rhythm of farm life had always been a steady comfort to him, the cycle of seasons, the daily chores, and the predictable quiet of rural life. But tonight, as the field seemed to stretch farther and farther before him, there was something different about the stillness. Something off. He shook it off. It was probably just the exhaustion of another long day, carrying heavy sacks, fixing old fences, and trying to get everything in place before the fall harvest started. It had been a hard year. Still, he knew there was nothing he loved more than the field. The land had a way of grounding him, giving him a sense of purpose, and making the weight of the world feel a little lighter. Tonight was supposed to be no different. James had planned on walking the edges of the field, checking the fences and clearing a path where the grass had begun to overgrow. He had already passed the small creek that ran alongside the property, the water rippling over the rocks in a quiet, soothing pattern. The further he walked, the more familiar the landscape became. The broken fence posts, the old stone wall where the ivy grew thick, the way the tall grass would brush against his legs. But as he ventured deeper into the field, something unusual caught his attention. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker in his peripheral vision, a shape in the distance, just at the edge of his sight. James squinted, his brow furrowing in confusion. It couldn't be a person. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one had been out this far in ages. Curiosity gnawed at him, as it always did when something felt out of place. Slowly, he moved toward the spot, the soft crunch of grass beneath his boots the only sound breaking the eerie silence. With each step, the object ahead became clearer. At first, it looked like a tall structure, some kind of small shack, perhaps, or an abandoned shed. But as he drew closer, the figure solidified in the twilight, a door. A large, wooden door standing alone in the middle of the field. No walls, no house behind it, just a solitary, freestanding door, its surface dark with age, the handle worn and chipped. The door seemed out of place, a stark contrast to the natural beauty of the field. There was nothing else around it, no house, no building, just an open, empty space, and the door. James froze. He couldn't remember ever seeing that door before. He had walked this field countless times, always familiar with every inch of it. Yet here it was, an old, weathered door, standing tall and out of place. He knew it hadn't been there the day before, not even the week before. It wasn't the kind of thing you could miss. The world around it was untouched, no footprints or signs of someone walking toward it. His heart began to race, the first stirrings of unease prickling at the back of his neck. The strange door beckoned him. He could almost hear it calling out to him, urging him to step closer, to investigate what lay beyond it. The wind rustled the long grasses at his feet, but there was a stillness around the door, as if it were waiting for him. James took another hesitant step forward, his boots brushing against the tall grass, the air growing stiller with every movement he made. His curiosity was battling with a growing sense of discomfort, that nagging feeling deep within him that something wasn't quite right. There was a part of him that wanted to turn around and walk away, but something about the door kept him rooted in place, a pull he couldn't ignore. The door was familiar in an unsettling way. It wasn't anything extraordinary, nothing grand or ornate. But there was something in the way it stood there, tall and resolute in the field, that gave it a sense of significance. It was almost as if it didn't belong there, as though it was meant to be somewhere else, somewhere far away. Maybe that's why it seemed so odd to him, why he couldn't shake the sense that this door wasn't just out of place, but wrong. James knew that the only way to shake the feeling of unease was to face it head-on. He had to see what was behind it, even if the instinct inside him screamed not to. He reached out a trembling hand and gripped the brass doorknob, which felt warm to the touch despite the cooling evening air. There was a jolt of static energy in the air as his fingers wrapped around the knob. His heart skipped a beat, but he pressed on, turning the handle. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, as though it hadn't been moved in ages. The sound felt out of place, louder than it should have been in the vast, empty field. His breath caught in his throat as he peered through the small crack he'd opened. Beyond the door was darkness. There was no room, no landscape, just a black void. It was as if the door led to nothingness, to an emptiness that stretched far beyond what he could comprehend. The blackness seemed to stretch on forever, and the longer he stared into it, the more his mind began to lose its grip on reality. James stumbled back, his pulse racing, but the door refused to close. It stayed open, gaping at him like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. He took another step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his pocket where his phone sat, hoping to take a picture or call for help, but the words caught in his throat. The feeling in his gut intensified, the air felt thicker, like it was pressing in on him. His mind was spinning, the door's presence consuming his every thought. As he backed away, he realized that something else had changed. The wind had stopped. The grass around him was motionless, as if time itself had frozen. It was just him, the door, and the growing unease gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. And then he heard it, a whisper. A faint voice, coming from behind the door. He couldn't make out the words, but it was there. A soft, distant murmur, like a voice calling to him from the other side. The chill that ran up his spine was immediate, bone deep. This wasn't right. The door wasn't supposed to be here. It didn't belong. James stood still for a moment, staring at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The faint whisper continued, urging him closer. His body was frozen, caught between the fear that told him to run and the curiosity that urged him forward. And that's when he realized he wasn't alone. The faintest silhouette appeared in the void behind the door, its outline barely visible in the darkness. It was a figure, human-shaped but not quite right. It stood there, unmoving, waiting for something. James swallowed hard, his pulse racing as the world around him seemed to shrink. He wasn't sure if he could move, if he should move. But his feet wouldn't listen to him. The door, the figure, everything felt too real, too close. He had to make a choice. Step forward, or step away. But in that moment, he wasn't sure which was safer. James stood still in the field, his heartbeat echoing in his ears, drowned by the unsettling quiet that had fallen over the land. The air around him was dense, almost suffocating with an unnatural stillness. The golden hues of the setting sun had faded into deep shades of purple and indigo, making the door stand out even more, like a cruel mirage in the middle of an endless sea of grass. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the dry rustling of the tall wheat stalks, brushing against each other as if whispering secrets. James' eyes were locked on the door. His breath was shallow, and his thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear: it wasn't supposed to be there. As much as the door filled him with a gnawing sense of dread, it also called to him. That contradiction was powerful, curiosity and terror, pulling him in opposite directions. What was it doing here? Why was it standing alone, with no walls, no house, no structure behind it? It seemed so out of place, yet there it stood, as though it had always been a part of the landscape. James was no stranger to the mysteries of nature. He had spent years on this farm, wandering through these fields, learning every crevice and corner. He could tell you where the old barn used to stand, the place where the rabbit burrows were hidden, the spot by the creek where the frogs always croaked. He knew this land better than he knew himself. And yet, this door, this thing, was a complete stranger to him. He could almost feel the door's presence in the back of his mind, tugging at his thoughts, urging him to step closer, to investigate. The whisper of the wind through the grass felt like a beckoning call, a siren song that demanded his attention. He took a cautious step forward, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He had to see for himself. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe it had been put here as some sort of joke by the kids who lived down the road. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He knew those kids well enough, and they were harmless enough, but they didn't pull stunts like this. The door loomed in front of him, almost mocking him with its presence. It wasn't imposing, no grandiose frame or intricate carvings. It was a simple, wooden door, painted a dark, faded brown. Its hinges were old and rusted, the surface of the wood weathered and chipped from years of exposure to the elements. The brass handle was cold to the touch, despite the warmth of the evening air, and seemed to shimmer just slightly, catching the dying rays of the sun. James reached out, his fingers brushing against the wood. He couldn't explain why, but it felt familiar, like he had touched it before, or perhaps something like it. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the growing unease in his chest. There was no reason for the door to be here, none at all. Yet here it was, waiting for him. His eyes scanned the field around him. There were no other signs of anything, no footprints, no movement, nothing that could explain the door's sudden appearance. It stood alone, isolated in the middle of the vast field, as if it had been dropped from the sky. It wasn't just a door. It was a question, a puzzle. And James had always been a man who sought answers, even when they were shrouded in fear. Curiosity clawed at his mind. He needed to know what lay beyond it. The wind picked up again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the soft whisper of the tall grass. This wind felt cold, like something otherworldly had just passed by, something that shouldn't have been there. It swirled around him in an almost protective manner, urging him to step closer. His boots felt heavier with each step, like the very earth was resisting him. But he pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and excitement. The closer he got, the clearer the door became, and with it, a strange feeling of recognition. The door was more than just an object. It was a portal. Something about it seemed to call out to him in a way he couldn't explain. James' mind raced through possibilities. Was it some sort of optical illusion? A mirage caused by the setting sun? But no, that didn't make sense. There was no way his eyes could be deceiving him like this. He stood before the door now, less than a foot away. The wood was weathered but still sturdy, and the hinges were just slightly askew, as though the door had been moved recently. The brass handle gleamed eerily in the fading sunlight. And as his hand hovered near it, something seemed to stir behind the door, something faint but unmistakable. A whisper. It wasn't a voice, at least not a clear one, but it was there, just at the edge of hearing. A faint murmur, like the rustling of leaves, the sound of someone calling to him from the other side. James froze. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The whisper grew louder, but it still wasn't clear. It was just a low hum, a voice beneath the surface, like a distant echo or a half-remembered dream. His fingers twitched toward the door handle, and for a moment, he wondered if he should turn away. The thought of leaving, of walking back to the safety of the farmhouse, seemed like the wisest course of action. But curiosity had its grip on him, a hold so strong he couldn't let go. The voice, the whisper, seemed to call him, beckoning him into the unknown. He grabbed the handle. It turned easily under his fingers, the brass cool to the touch, and the door creaked open with a sound that sent a shiver up his spine. The crack in the door revealed nothing but a void darkness that seemed to extend beyond the bounds of his understanding. There was no room beyond the door, no walls, no place. Just an empty blackness that swallowed everything in its path. James blinked, stepping back slightly as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. His heart pounded in his chest. The door couldn't just lead to nothing, could it? He pushed the door open further, his curiosity now burning in his veins. The space beyond the door seemed endless. The darkness was absolute, as if the door had opened into another world entirely. The void seemed to stretch out into infinity, and with every inch he moved closer, the feeling of dread deepened. But then, just as quickly as it had started, a flicker of light appeared at the edge of the darkness. James stepped forward, his mind racing. The light flickered again, like a candle flame in the distance. It was weak but unmistakable. What was it? Was there something on the other side of the door? Something waiting for him? He reached out, his heart hammering in his chest, and placed his hand over the threshold, feeling the cold air from beyond. A chill ran through his body, and the whisper returned, louder now, clearer, almost like a voice calling his name. James. He jerked his hand back, his heart slamming against his ribs. His breath was shallow, his body frozen in place. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the door, couldn't stop himself from looking at the blackness beyond. But then, something even stranger happened. The wind shifted again, and the door creaked once more, as though someone or something on the other side was pushing it shut. The whisper grew louder. It wasn't a voice anymore, but something more tangible, an invitation. The door wasn't just a door. It was an entrance. And it was waiting for him. James' heart pounded, his palms slick with sweat as he stood in front of the door. The light on the other side had grown brighter, almost beckoning, pulling him in with an invisible force. He could feel the pull deep in his bones, an urge to step through the threshold, to leave behind the world he knew for something far more sinister, yet tantalizing. The wind had died down once again, leaving only the sound of his shallow breaths and the occasional creak of the door as it moved ever so slightly with the breeze. The light beyond flickered like a distant flame, almost too bright to look at directly, but James couldn't look away. His fingers brushed the handle again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. The door opened with an almost sickening ease, a silent invitation to what lay on the other side. He stepped forward, his legs heavy, as if he were wading through deep water. The world around him faded as his foot crossed the threshold. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, time itself appeared to stand still. The familiar world of the field, the golden wheat, the sun slipping below the horizon, all of it seemed to slip away, as though swallowed by the abyss beyond the door. The air was different here, darker, thicker, laden with an oppressive weight. It felt wrong, like a place that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. A deep, unshakable feeling of unease settled over him as he looked around. The light was dim, but the world on the other side of the door felt endless, stretching far beyond what his eyes could perceive. He stood in a field of sorts, but it was wrong, twisted. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, as if the earth itself had been drained of its solidity. The grass that grew in sporadic patches seemed dull, withered, grayish-green instead of vibrant and alive. No birds sang, no breeze whispered. There was nothing here, just a void that stretched on forever, interrupted only by the door through which he had entered. It felt as though he was standing on the edge of the world, looking into an abyss. And yet, there was something else, the sensation of being watched. His skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He could feel eyes on him, though there was no one in sight. He turned around, scanning the surroundings, but the door was already fading behind him, its frame now blending seamlessly into the emptiness. Panic flared in his chest. He turned back around, fully aware that he had no idea how to return. The silence here was suffocating, and the world seemed to close in on him. He could hear his own breathing, the rush of blood in his ears, the rhythm of his heartbeat. Every step he took felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening, resisting his movements. Then, as though summoned by his very thoughts, something shifted. A sound. It was faint at first, so quiet that he wasn't sure whether it was real or a product of his anxious mind. A soft scrape, followed by the faintest shuffle of something moving through the withered grass. It was coming from behind him, and before he could react, a low whisper rose from the ground below, a voice just out of reach. It didn't come from the air, nor from the trees that weren't there, no, it seemed to come from within the earth, deep underfoot. He froze, straining to hear. It was a language, or perhaps a name, his name. It whispered, over and over, just at the edge of comprehension. James. He spun around, heart thumping wildly. Nothing. The vast emptiness stretched out, and yet there was a presence, something intangible, watching, waiting. The faint sound of shuffling continued, growing closer, louder. His first instinct was to run. But where? There was nothing here, just endless nothingness. The wind that had once been absent stirred again, a gust that sliced through the stillness, making the dry grass whisper against itself. It carried with it the faintest scent of decay, something old, rotting. His stomach churned. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, choked by the dread that had seeped into his very bones. Don't look back, he thought. But the words were futile. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to face whatever was coming. And then, there it was. A figure. Not human. Not entirely. James stumbled back, his heart racing as his gaze locked onto the shape that emerged from the shadows, from the corners of his vision. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. Its form was not entirely defined, as though it was struggling to solidify itself, shifting between solid and vapor, like a mirage. The figure was draped in a long, flowing cloak, but the fabric moved as if it were alive, writhing like something sentient, feeding off the air. The edges of the cloak shimmered with an eerie, spectral light. Its face was obscured, but James could feel its gaze piercing through the shifting veil of darkness, its eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. Every instinct told him to run. To flee from this thing, this presence that radiated an almost tangible malevolence. But his legs refused to move. The more he tried to back away, the more rooted he felt in place, as though the ground itself were holding him here, unwilling to let him escape. The creature took another step toward him. The earth beneath it seemed to ripple, distorting with every movement. Its form flickered again, and for a brief moment, James thought he saw something truly monstrous beneath its cloak, something long and twisted, with multiple limbs and a gaping, hollow mouth that never quite closed. It was getting closer, but still, James couldn't move. He could only watch, his body paralyzed with fear. The sound of the creature's breath, or whatever passed for its breath, was a deep, hollow rasp, like the grinding of stone against stone. And then, it spoke. Not in words, but in a low, guttural hum that resonated deep within his chest, vibrating through his very bones. The hum was almost familiar, like an old memory, a sound he had heard before but couldn't quite place. It was cold, and it crawled under his skin, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. "Come closer." The voice, if you could even call it that, echoed in his mind, sending tremors of dread through him. The creature extended a hand, its fingers elongated and skeletal, reaching for him with a terrifyingly slow precision. James tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice a strangled whisper. He couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too oppressive. He wanted to run, but the ground kept him anchored, the weight of the darkness holding him in place. The creature came closer, its hand reaching. "Don't resist." And then, as though the world itself had shifted, the figure stopped. Its outstretched hand hovered just inches from his chest, its fingers twitching with an unsettling eagerness. James gasped, finally able to draw in a shaky breath. His legs trembled, threatening to give way beneath him. The creature stared at him, its unseen eyes burning through the darkness. And then, it whispered, a voice in his ear, a cold breath brushing against his skin. "Do you know why you're here?" The world around James began to blur, his vision narrowing into a tunnel as panic began to rise like bile in his throat. The soft hum of the field's unnatural stillness filled his ears, but it was drowned out by the pounding of his own heart, each beat a drum that seemed to signal his doom. The tall figure was gone, swallowed by the mist that rolled in thicker now, as though it had been waiting for this very moment to manifest fully. The faint whispering from behind him had ceased, but the echo of its words clung to the edges of his mind, as if they had been branded there. "Do you know why you're here?" James stumbled back, the question lingering like a poison. He had been trying so desperately to ignore it, to keep moving, to find anything familiar in this place. But now, in the terrifying silence that followed the disappearance of the figure, the weight of the question hit him with full force. The thing that had touched his soul with its chilling words, was it real? Or was it something darker? Something more insidious? Was it a part of this place? Or was it himself? As he spun around, trying to make sense of it all, he felt the air shift once again, this time, like a breath being held in the deepest crevice of the world. His body shuddered, but there was nowhere to run. The path he had once walked was no longer visible. In fact, nothing was. The field was gone. The grass had withered, now replaced by something else, something wrong, almost like a fine layer of frost, but it was black. Black as night. The vast sky above him had turned an inky black, filled with swirling shadows that seemed to creep down to the earth, as though the sky itself were devouring the world beneath it. His breath caught in his throat. The door, the one that had led him here, was nowhere to be seen. It had disappeared completely, leaving only an ominous, endless void where once it had stood. His mind raced, frantically piecing together the fragmented images of his journey. He had come from somewhere, hadn't he? But that place, his home, was far, far away. He couldn't remember the exact path he had taken to reach the door. He couldn't remember anything, other than this vast, oppressive landscape stretching before him, with no end in sight. In the pit of his stomach, a feeling that had been building since his first step into this nightmare now surged violently, reaching up to his throat and suffocating him. He was stuck here. Trapped. He had no way of getting back. And something told him that there was no going back anyway. Even if he found the door again, even if it was right before his eyes, what he would face on the other side wouldn't be his home. It would be something worse. The place beyond this door wasn't a place at all. It was nothing. The realization hit him like a slap to the face, a rush of cold terror filling every fiber of his being. He had walked into this field, but now it was clear, he wasn't just trapped in the field, he was trapped in himself. This was a reflection of his own fears, his own doubts, twisted and magnified by something dark and ancient. The door hadn't led him anywhere. It had led him into the very core of his soul, to the place where all his buried regrets, all his suppressed fears, had festered in the dark. He had opened the door to this nightmare when he allowed himself to succumb to curiosity, to desire for something beyond the mundane. And now, there was no escape. Behind him, a rustling noise broke the silence. He turned, his heart hammering in his chest, his eyes wide with the desperate hope that it was nothing, just the wind, maybe. But there was no wind. The air was still, thick, stifling. And yet, there it was again. The rustling. A shuffling sound, too rhythmic to be the wind, too deliberate to be the remnants of a lost gust. It was closer this time, almost on top of him. He turned around fully, instinctually pulling himself into a defensive stance, ready to face whatever horrors lurked in the shadows of this place. But there was no figure, no monstrous shape waiting for him. Instead, there was only a pale, faint outline, barely visible in the flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere, lighting the scene with an unnatural, sickly glow. It was the outline of the door. But it wasn't the same door he had passed through earlier. This one was broken, its edges cracked and jagged, the frame distorted as if the reality surrounding it had fractured. The light behind it pulsed, not steady but erratic, as if the very nature of what lay on the other side was unstable, shifting, undecidable. James took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat as the door flickered again, a brief glimpse of the world beyond spilling out like a terrible secret, and then vanishing just as quickly. For the briefest moment, he saw it. The other side of the door. A place that looked like home. The house in which he had grown up. His childhood room. The smell of his mother's cooking. The sound of his father's laugh. But it was wrong. It was too perfect, too serene. It was everything he had wanted, everything he had lost, everything that he had tried to forget. It was a distorted, idealized memory, a temptation. A lie. The realization crashed into him like a flood. This door wasn't a portal to the outside world. It wasn't a way to escape this place. The door wasn't leading him anywhere, it was trapping him in his own past. It was a mirror of his deepest longings and regrets, an endless cycle of his own making. This place wasn't meant to be escaped. It was meant to hold him here, forever. To twist him until he was nothing but a shell of his former self, consumed by his own desires and fears. The whispers returned. Soft, insistent. They filled his ears like static, the voice shifting, growing deeper, more menacing. Do you know why you're here, James? It was no longer just a whisper. It was an overwhelming roar, crashing into his mind, shaking his very bones. The air seemed to shift around him, thickening, pressing in on him. The field was no longer a place, it was a trap. He wasn't meant to leave. He had always been meant to stay. You are lost here, James. Just like the others. Just like you were always meant to be. The shadows began to dance, flickering as though alive, crawling toward him from every angle. Figures emerged from the mist. Familiar faces, his mother, his father, old friends, all staring at him with vacant eyes, their forms disintegrating into smoke as they came closer, their mouths moving, but no sound escaping. Their faces twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. They were reaching for him, pulling him toward them. James backed away, trembling, his hands raised in front of him as though he could somehow push them away. He tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was full of sand, dry and choking. His eyes were wide with terror as he realized that he wasn't just trapped in this place, he was being consumed by it. His memories, his regrets, his desires, they were turning against him, shaping this nightmare. The door behind him flickered again, now completely transparent. A reflection of himself stared back at him, a broken man, consumed by fear, guilt, and longing. The door was an illusion. There was no escape. And then, a figure stepped through the door. Not a person, not even a creature, but a shape, a shadow. It reached out, its fingers wrapping around James' wrist. Cold. Ice cold. The grip tightened. Welcome home, James. And with that, the door slammed shut. The world around James continued to collapse in on itself. He was standing in the field, but it no longer looked like a field, it was a shadow, a forgotten dream, a place that only existed because he believed it did. The door had disappeared, and so had the path. His memories, his past, everything that had once made sense, was now as warped as the landscape before him. It was all wrong, everything. There was no ground beneath his feet, only that oppressive, dark fog that had crept in from every direction, swallowing the world whole. James' breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around. The figures that had once surrounded him, the faceless, the shadowy forms, were gone, vanished like smoke. But their absence left an even heavier weight in the air. The world was suffocatingly quiet now. Too quiet. Not even the wind moved. It was as though time itself had stopped. Why am I here? The question came again, the whisper threading its way through the silence. It was familiar now, no longer a voice that belonged to anyone or anything. It was his own voice, echoing in the hollow of his mind, pressing against his skull as if it were a warning, a reminder. He wasn't just lost. No, he wasn't lost at all. He had found something. The weight of that realization was like a stone in his gut. He had been looking for an answer, a way out, some explanation to this nightmare. But now, in the eerie calm that had descended upon him, he understood what was happening. There was no way out. There was no escape from this place. And there was no escape from himself. James stood still, his feet rooted to the frozen earth, his heart thudding with a brutal rhythm in his chest. In the distance, the faintest glimmer of light broke through the fog, a pinpoint of clarity in the swirling blackness. But it was not an invitation. It was a mirage, like everything else in this place. Another trick of the mind, another lie that the field had woven into the fabric of his thoughts. He wanted to run, to flee, to turn away from everything that he now knew was real, this place, the door, the figures. His whole life had led him here, to this crossroads. And now, in the oppressive weight of the silence, he realized the truth. This wasn't a test of physical strength or survival. This wasn't about escaping the mist or finding a way to cross the threshold. This was a test of choice. The choice was simple, but it was anything but easy. Do you want to leave? The question echoed in his mind like a chant, repeating itself over and over. The very air seemed to bend around him, the fog thickening as it swirled around his legs. James forced himself to breathe deeply, to focus. There had to be an answer. There had to be a way to break free. The ground beneath him rippled, as if answering his thoughts. The landscape shifted, undulating like water in a pond disturbed by a stone. The black fog thickened and rolled, but this time, it wasn't an overwhelming presence. This time, it felt like an invitation, an opening. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself, trying to push the panic out of his chest, out of his throat. The air was suffocating, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was that he couldn't remember how long he had been here. How many hours had passed? Days? Was it even real time anymore? The rules of this place didn't obey any kind of logic. There were no answers in this place, no roadmaps, no guideposts. And yet, James had learned something in the moments after the door had disappeared, in the moments when the shadowy figures had circled him. He had realized that the key to his survival, to his escape, didn't lie in finding a way to outrun the terror or in trying to make sense of this nightmare. It lay in accepting it. That was the choice, wasn't it? It had always been the choice. Do you want to leave? It wasn't just a question of physically walking away from this place. It wasn't a question of opening the door and stepping into another world, a world where everything made sense. No. It was about whether or not he could accept the truth of what he had found. The truth that he wasn't alone in this field. He had never been alone. The figures, the whispers, the echoes of things forgotten, those were parts of him. Parts of his past, his desires, his darkest regrets. They were the choices he had made, the paths he had turned away from, the things he had buried deep inside of himself. They were his fears, his dreams, his nightmares. The door had never led him into a world beyond this field, it had led him deeper into his own mind. And now, it was up to him to decide if he wanted to live with those things or if he wanted to fight them. James opened his eyes, staring into the vast emptiness ahead of him. The light in the distance had dimmed, but he could still feel it. There was no denying it now. He could walk towards it. He could leave this place. But the truth was, there was no escaping what had happened here. There was no escaping what he had discovered about himself. The only way to break free was to face it, to confront everything that had brought him to this moment. He took a step forward. The fog parted in front of him, clearing like smoke blown away by the wind. But as it did, something shifted. The ground beneath his feet softened, turning to mud. The air became thick and oppressive once more, pulling him back into the field. The light was still there, beckoning. But now, it wasn't as distant as it had been before. It was close. It was just within reach. And yet, James stopped. The hesitation was brief, but it was enough. There, in the stillness of his own mind, he made the choice. The door wasn't just an object. It wasn't a thing that existed somewhere in the field. The door was within him. It had always been. The answer, the way out, wasn't through another place. It was through accepting the choices he had made, the fears he had buried. The terror, the unease, the dread, it was all part of him. He couldn't outrun it. He could only live with it. James took a deep breath and stepped forward, deeper into the fog, deeper into the swirling nothingness that surrounded him. The light flickered, its glow fading into the distance, but he didn't look back. His footsteps were sure now, even as the world seemed to stretch on forever. The door was gone, and yet, he felt something shift within him. It wasn't the end of the nightmare, but perhaps it was the beginning of understanding it. As he walked, the whispers that had filled his mind began to fade. Not because they had vanished, but because they no longer mattered. He didn't need to hear them. He didn't need to fear them. And, in that final, desperate choice to accept his fate, to walk through the darkness and face the truth, James realized the one thing that he had been blind to all along. The door had never been the key to his survival. He had always been the key,